Good morning. My name is Charlie Sachs. I'm a member here of the Ethical Humanist Society. Welcome. We're glad you're here. Our Sunday morning programs alternate weekly between guest speaker and one of our community days, which are designed to bring us together to learn, grow, and foster community engagement. This Sunday is a community day featuring the writings from members of our Writers Group. The goal and purpose of the Writers Group is to create and support original content of any style from anyone who is interested in writing, regardless of prior experience or proficiency. Today's program features original works, including narratives, reflections, and fictional stories that are mystical, humorous, endearing, inspiring, and sobering. The printed programs on the chairs that are distributed around the auditorium have the authors, titles, and brief descriptions of the works that will be shared this morning, and more information on the Writers Group. We will proceed through the program with each writer briefly introducing the next. Each piece lasts between 6 to 10 minutes for a total of approximately 70 minutes of material.
So, part one. This incident took place in August of 2014, and I still have a receipt from all wildlife animal eviction. The first part of the story I've told several times, but now I'm committing it to print. One Friday evening, my wife and I had dinner guests. Outside our kitchen window, there's a rather large ornamental tree. I looked out shortly before dark, and there was what I took to be a small or medium-sized raccoon. He was making a monkey of himself with impunity, and I resolved to trap the beast. I live in a small town, Woodstock, Illinois, which is just about surrounded by open areas. Over the last 20 years or so, I have trapped numerous chipmunks and squirrels, and I ran them out of town. Once a family of squirrels was living in my attic. They were easy to trap. I hate killing animals, but I've killed one or two mice and a bat that was terrorizing my family. Several years before the incident I here describe, I had planted sweet potato vines in mid-May, and a day or two later they were eaten. A neighbor told me that he had seen a groundhog in one of my flower beds, so I bought a large animal trap. Incidentally, Woodstock happens to be the town where the movie Groundhog Day was filmed. Anyway, I caught the trespasser and I let it go out of town about 5 miles to the east toward the town of Crystal Lake. So I was confident about getting this raccoon, even though these critters have a pretty nasty reputation. I found a medium-sized trap, a metal cage about 2 feet long and 7 inches wide and 7 inches in height. Somehow we had a purple marshmallow, maybe left over from Easter, and I stuck it in as bait. There it is. So I set the trap out where I thought the raccoon would get it. The next morning I went out to the trap with high hopes, only to have them deflated. There in the cage, pacing steadily to and fro, was a skunk. I had heard that they could not spray if they couldn't lift their tail. I thought about putting the trap on top of my car and driving it to the edge of the woods and releasing the thing in the field nearby, but I felt that this was too risky. If I were sprayed, my wife would probably have sent me to a motel for 3 days with 3 bottles of Lysol, and I would never have heard the end of it. She had recently retired from communications work in county government, and she ordered me, or at least strongly suggested, that I call a county agency animal control. When I did, an officious female voice answered the phone. And when I told her I had inadvertently trapped the skunk, she bellowed in a shrill voice, "Do you have a trapping license?" I hung up the phone immediately, expecting that I would soon be handcuffed by the county sheriff. Anyway. On the web, I located all wildlife animal eviction. And within about 2 hours, and for a mere $225, a young man came over from this company. I guess I was naive to think that my skunk was going to survive. There are probably not too many places that a licensed control company can relocate a skunk. The young eviction specialist told me that he was going to terminate the skunk with a poisoned dart. What could I do? Its life was unceremoniously ended. I never saw the raccoon again either. But I did see another skunk a few years later. So this is part 2, and this is a story I don't really like to tell. At the rear border of my property, there grows a line of honeysuckle bushes. And about 15 feet beyond the bushes is the home of plumber Ed, my neighbor for many years. Ed and I never communicated much, even when our children were young. I did hire Ed's company for 2 hot water heaters. He installed one, and just a few years later it gave out, and he abruptly told me that I needed another one. I subsequently learned that you're supposed to drain or flush a hot water heater every 6 months to clear out the sediment. I thought it would have been neighborly of Ed to tell me that before I had to buy the second hot water heater. Anyway, before this incident, Ed and I were not particularly good friends. And after that, we almost never spoke. When the accident came, when we accidentally came close to one another in our yards, we offered a perfunctory nod and waved our hands. Ed seemed a very lonely individual. Years ago, he and his wife divorced and his daughters moved away. But even my wife, who is friendly with almost everyone in the world, was not particularly fond of Ed. One evening, probably not long before the COVID-19 eruption, I saw a skunk patrolling the back of Ed's house. Sometime later, he too had trapped the skunk. It was pacing in a cage on the side of his driveway, which was visible from my yard. Ed did not call all wildlife animal eviction. A few days later, I saw the skunk again. It was still pacing in the cage. A few days later, it was still pacing. It was obvious that Ed was going to let the thing starve to death or dehydrate. I thought about calling animal control and informing them, but I just went on with my busy life, and then the trap was gone. Perhaps a year later, there were several police vehicles at Ed's house. The garage door was open. I did not inquire, but soon learned that Ed was dead. My brother-in-law, a reliable town gossip, told me a day or two later that Ed had shot himself. I doubt that remorse over the trapped skunk was a factor in his decision. Perhaps the worst part of this, for me, was I had no tender feelings about it. I do sometimes wonder about my own callousness, but at least I have compassion for trapped animals. So I wonder if perhaps there is a humanist lesson here, or at least a human one, because sometimes I do feel something like regret at not being a better neighbor to Ed. Of course, in the Bible, in both Leviticus and Mark, it says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." But this idea is unrealistic. I searched the 3 humanist manifestos for guidance about being a good neighbor, and I found something of a global perspective on caring and empathy, but no practical advice. So we have to construct our own rules about being a neighbor in the 21st century, and mine is this. If the neighbor on the other side of your honeysuckle bushes is non-communicative, doesn't communicate, you need to say hello to him at least twice a year and ask him how things are going. Then, if the worst happens, you will at least have a clearer conscience. Thank you. All right.
This essay is based on this book, The Narrative on the Life of Frederick Douglass. It's not a very thick book or so forth, but it's a very powerful, excellent book to read about what slavery was really like from the point of view of one who was a slave and then ran away to get his freedom. All right. I have found that one of the most successful pieces of literature for motivating students to read and write is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. It opens up so many issues of adolescence, such as self-esteem, identity, rebellion against unjust authority and laws, individual dignity, and control over one's life and working conditions. Add to this a poetic writing style, and one readily understands why students become absorbed in the narrative. Farragut Career Academy, where I have taught since 1965, is located in the inner city on Chicago's southwest side. Our students are Hispanic, about 85% of the demographics, student demographics, and African American, about 15% of the student demographics. A large portion of them are on public aid and below grade level. Much of their energy is expended in a day-to-day struggle against gangbangers and other social ills. I use the narrative in my American history and ethnic studies courses. Students in these classes are upperclassmen. Many students are not aware of Douglass. Indeed, there are many adults who are not aware of Douglass as well. Others may have only a vague recollection of hearing about him in history class. Before we begin reading the book, I give some background information on the period and on slavery. In addition, I show a documentary movie, unfortunately out of print, on the life of Douglass entitled House on Cedar Hill. Until they read the narrative, most of my students are unaware of how inhumane slavery was. Some become visibly angry about what they learn. I attempt to channel that anger into constructive actions that they can take for themselves and others, using Douglass as their role model. For instance, I show them that they can have better control of their destiny by empowering themselves with better literacy skills. Moreover, I point out that Douglass exemplified self-respect, strong moral character, aggressiveness, courage, intelligence, and a deep sense of racial pride and responsibility. For Douglass, struggle was more important than compromise, dedication to the freedom of his people more important than his own safety. He felt responsible for secretly educating his fellow slaves and for helping them escape from their bondage. The message to students: fight against prejudice, not using guns or fists or whatever, but using prejudice. The message to students: fight against prejudice using reason, using literary skills. Don't enslave yourselves with voluntary ignorance, drugs, gangs, or early teenage pregnancy. Help others as you have been helped. While reading the narrative, the students keep journals. Not surprisingly, I get many moving entries inspired by certain sections of the book. In the early part of the narrative, Douglass writes about the significance of the spirituals sung in the fields by the slaves, or sorrow songs. One class heard recordings of some of these sorrow songs, and one of our music teachers gave a special presentation showing the link between spirituals, blues, and gospel music. One Hispanic student who's not afraid to cross racial boundaries has some close African American friends. One of these friends invited him to attend a church service. For the young Hispanic, it was a beautiful spiritual revelation. He wrote, quote, "Believe me, there's nothing like a black church service. It cannot be copied. The preacher preaches up a storm and gets reactions from the congregation. Call and response is what it's called. Then there would be the singing of the church choir. That church would rock. One could feel welling up within oneself a sense of love, a sense of faith, a sense of unity, a sense of hope." And I can attest to that because I've been to black church services on Sundays, and indeed, no one sleeps during the services. Douglas's 2-hour fight with a slave breaker, Edward Covey, elicited another student's comment. "I envy Douglas's courage in fighting Edward Covey and to escape his master. Never have I heard a story like this, the way he conquered his problems," close quote. In the first chapter, Douglas relates how he hardly knew his mother, and that when she died, it was as if a stranger died. That led to this poignant journal entry, quote, "I'm really sorry about Douglas's family that he lost or never saw. I know how Douglas feels because I never saw my mother because we got separated just like Douglas did," close quote. And then, of course, I think, and maybe it comes to your mind too, on the southern border here, the children inhumanely being separated from their parents, and to this day, some of them have still not been reunited with their parents. What we have here are prime examples of how a powerful public writing style helped these Hispanic students, poetic writing style, helped these Hispanic students identify with an intelligent, courageous black slave, and thereby narrow some cultural and ethnic gaps. Another writing activity I have the class do involves elements of a Twilight Zone experience. Students are to pretend it's 1845 and to write a letter to Douglas indicating their reactions and feelings to his narrative. But within the letter, they will crisscross between the past and the present. Students have no problem in straddling the timelines and usually enjoy doing the assignment. However, for those who wish an alternative assignment, I offer the essay topic, quote, "If Frederick Douglass were alive today, what message would he bring to Farragut Career Academy students about improving racial relations?" Close quote. Another activity involves the use of large white poster boards. Small groups of students complete a poster board book report on a narrative by doing what I call story mapping. In the middle of the board goes the title, author, and publisher. On the left and right sides of each board, there are sections for a character map of one of the protagonists, new vocabulary words, setting, plot, a symbol that students invent that represents the story, and 3 completed sentences about the book. At the bottom of the board, the theme or message is stated and explained. Students can be as creative as possible in putting this together, including the use of drawings and pictures. Students love working in groups and doing this kind of writing assignment. In past years, I've gotten some extremely well-done poster board story maps that have been displayed in the classroom as well as school-wide. Finally, since the students have been writing about Douglas's story, I asked them to write their own stories, which students really like to do once they get over their initial reluctance or perception that their lives are dull. Realistically, how often does any authority figure ask them to write about their own souls and to make themselves the topic of a written school assignment? It gives the students a sense of personal importance, the type of empowerment discussed in the narrative when Douglas relates how he secretly learned to read and write and how that changed him from a non-thinking slave to a thinking man who became resurrected, if you will. When the students complete their autobiographies and see them displayed in the room, it gives a needed boost to their vulnerable self-images. narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, I would like to emphasize in closing here, is a very invaluable and powerful autobiography that not only inspires students to write, but also teaches them that people can transcend group distinctions, whether racial, ethnic, class, or gender. It also shows them the link between literacy and personal empowerment, that they too can overcome personal obstacles and become the masters of their own fates. Thank you.
I wrote a short story because some time back I read a book it was called An Algerian Childhood. And there's a series of short stories written by various Algerian authors about growing up in Algeria. And I thought it would be interesting to write a story about growing up in America. We all have different childhoods, and I wanted to explore mine in a short story. So here goes. It's called Puddles. Mrs. Miller rushed out of the house with curlers and a lit cigarette dangling from her lips. "Let's go, girls," she yelled. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she dropped her daughters off at the pool, then sprinted back home to make a gin and tonic and watch All My Children. My sister and I looked on wistfully as we watched the station wagon pull out of the driveway. The basket in the trunk overflowed with sandwiches, chips, Oreos, and 2 gallons of iced tea sweating in the July heat. Janice, the older sister, obliviously smacked on bubblegum and stared out the window from the back seat. Emily was in the front seat, bopping along to Girls Just Want to Have Fun, blasting from the car radio. My younger sister stuck her tongue out as they drove by, but they barely noticed. I slowly turned back to our hopscotch game on the cracked sidewalk. I was mid-hop when my mother yelled out, "Girls, where are you? The baby's crying." It was my turn to go. Annoyed, I trudged back inside to check on my 2-year-old cousin, Susie. She wasn't fully awake, but she was whimpering in her sleep, so I gently rocked the cradle until she stopped. I was tiptoeing back outside just as my mother came up from the basement with yet another basket of laundry. "Here, fold these and put them away." She handed me the laundry basket. This was the 3rd load today. I plopped down on the floor in the living room, folding stained but clean uniforms. Over 50 close and distant relatives lived with us at the beginning of their life in America. One by one, during the 80s, they arrived with suitcases full of spices, pots, and pans. These future successful entrepreneurs slept on cheap blankets in our living room until they got jobs and could afford to move out. My mother did all the cooking and cleaning, and my sister and I had no choice but to stay home and help her. Feeling bored, I turned the TV on low and watched a rerun of the Brady Bunch as I continued to fold clothes. "Why do I always get peanut butter and jelly sandwiches?" Cindy, the youngest Brady, asked her mother. "Because you love them, Cindy, dear," responded her mother affectionately. "Ugh," I muttered under my breath. The phone rang, interrupting my resentment of a life where kids got to pout and complain, and parents gently appeased them with sweetness and humor. I ran to pick it up quickly so the annoying baby wouldn't wake up. "Do you want to come over? My mom just got me the new crystal Barbie," Kelly asked. Kelly was the only kid I knew who still sucked her thumb in the 6th grade. She and her brother were both adopted, and their parents bought them anything they wanted. She had more Barbies than anyone else in the neighborhood. Kelly lived just a few houses away and often invited me to play at her house, but not because we were friends. We weren't. She liked people coming over and admiring her Barbies, but she also knew I could only go if I brought little Susie with me. She was oddly jealous that I had a real baby to take care of. She liked to sing lullabies to Susie and push the stroller around her basement while I played with her Barbies. Sometimes Ralph, her brother, hung out with us in the basement. He made crank calls using random phone numbers from the yellow pages. "Oh, I can't," I whispered into the phone. "I have to help my mom." I hung up just as my mother came upstairs from the basement to prepare dinner for the hungry relatives who would be returning home for their first shift at Dunkin' Donuts or some convenience store. She stoically shuffled across the kitchen and began rinsing the rice. My parents grew up in rural India where the concept of summer camps or pools or Barbies didn't exist. Children worked alongside adults in homes and on the farm. A carefree youth was not only indulgent but lazy. So while other kids in the neighborhood were enjoying their summer break, I was a mini adult tasked with endless housework. But every now and then, I managed to squeeze in moments of summer laziness. After putting Susie to sleep, my sister and I felt we deserved ice cream. Wearing our Daisy Duke shorts and pink flip-flops, we raced to the corner Dairy Queen with 2 quarters we stole from my mother's coin purse. She wouldn't have given us the money if we asked, so we just took it. We got to the Dairy Queen just in time. Flashes of lightning suddenly replaced the oppressive heat. Within minutes, the sun disappeared from the sky. Sun disappeared and the sky unleashed a downpour so heavy we couldn't possibly walk back home. Stranded, we blissfully sat in the Dairy Queen, eating our dilly bars and giggling for no apparent reason. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the sun reemerged just as we licked the last bit. My sister ran ahead of me. "Mom's going to be mad if Susie wakes up and we're not home," she yelled out as she looked at me, taking my time. But I didn't care. The taste of chocolate lingered in my mouth. The cool breeze from the rain made me happily lethargic. I wasn't ready to go back to changing diapers and making silly faces to entertain a 2-year-old. Taking my flip-flops off, I splished and splashed in the puddles, singing "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." I danced and jumped from one puddle to the next, laughing and screaming with delight as only a 12-year-old child can. For a brief moment on that hot summer day, I took my stolen childhood back. Thank you.
They're hexagonal. The ubiquitous asphalt pavers in New York City parks. They're hexagonal. Having been born and raised in New York City, there are some of my earliest recollections of public spaces as a child. I recognized them intuitively, even if I had never before realized they were hexagonal, perhaps because I knew them before I knew what a hexagon was. I was revisiting the pavers on a walk through Central Park during a business trip in 2013. It was the first time I'd spent any time in Manhattan in 25 years. I was looking forward to this trip, as if I was being reacquainted with a lifelong friend. When I first arrived, even after 25 years, I experienced an instant, intimate familiarity. The feel of the humidity and the pressure of the sea level air, the smell of the salt water, the choreography and tempo of the New York street tango of pedestrians and vehicular traffic, the approaching and receding noise of the subway passing beneath the sidewalks, and the correlating rush of warm air through the grates of the street as the trains pushed through the tunnels. There was the sight of the garbage put out on the sidewalk, these days in bags rather than in cans in the past. It seemed quieter than what I remembered, not as much clanging, but there was still a cacophony of car horns and sirens echoing in the canyons of the buildings. Voices passed me on the sidewalks with distinctive New York accents in conversations peppered with laughs, exhortations, and expletives. Walking in Manhattan always offered a rich, flavorful, spiked cocktail of discovery and familiarity. I walked along blocks that I did not recall, yet were recognizable, if only for their character and feel. Walking by familiar places involved rediscovering them. Same place, different time, new perspective. I made a point of walking by many familiar places. The lobby of the Empire State Building, St. Peter's Church in the lower level of the Citibank Building, the Great Hall of Grand Central Station, and along the East River looking toward the United Nations and the apartment complex where my mother lived in the 1980s. These places were psychological touch points that offered glimpses of the past in instants that traversed decades. During these walks, being in the present meant experiencing the presence of the past. It produced preternatural feelings of stimulation, an aha moment, a comfortable ease of place, or the dissonance of something familiar lost in time, all experienced simultaneously. On the last day of my trip, after a morning walk, I had some spare time before I needed to head to the airport. I decided to take advantage of the opportunity to go to the Museum of Modern Art across the street from the hotel where I was staying. I had 75 minutes. Yes, a ridiculously compressed time to visit a world-class museum, but I was determined to take advantage of the opportunity. I arrived as the museum was opening, and there was already a line of visitors waiting to pay the admission to go inside. I used this time to plan my strategy. I grabbed a map of the museum and scoped the sequence of galleries I would visit based on their descriptions. I was among the first wave of morning visitors that flooded the museum. As the crowd mingled and meandered, I was struck by how many people were on their cell phones. As I went up to each floor, it was necessary to be alert to the phone zombies as they occupied conspicuous spaces without being cognizant of their impedance of others. It was as if their very essence of being was sucked into the void of their phones. It was weird. The first set of galleries I visited were decidedly underwhelming. Was I let down by deflated expectations? Was it a recurring coincidence of finding things that did not generate any interest or excitement? Or perhaps the art really was merely pretentious or poorly presented. A striking disappointment stirred agitation and amplified my urgency to find something notable or meaningful. Plowing through clouds of distracted patrons, posing for selfies, texting, and bellowing phone conversations did not help. I finally came across a docent and resigned myself to ask for directions. She patiently and respectfully listened to me as I explained where I'd been and my question of where I might find something of interest. Perceptively, she suggested a gallery with some 19th century modernists, Van Gogh's Starry Night, and Munch's The Scream. I thanked her and headed straight for that gallery. When I entered the gallery, I was immediately struck by the paintings. Miro, Picasso, a Cubist salon. The magnificent works that immediately captured my attention. The clutter of noise and distraction from the busy crowds receded as I walked further into the gallery and became immersed in the works. Eventually, I found Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, featuring the distinctive image of a clock draped over a tree branch, a painting that I had seen on a prior visit. But this was a bizarre experience. I used to like Dali, and in particular this painting. On this occasion, however, it did nothing for me. Nonetheless, I sensed the experience of my first impression from 30 years ago simultaneously with that day. Two impressions, years apart, like a 3D image without the glasses, as if layers of the image were lifted off the canvas, separate but the same. An experience of the dimension of time, same experience, two times, different, living twice at once. I moved on. I was able to focus on the paintings. The noise and distraction of the incidental crowd receded. There was just me, the paintings, and others who shared a similar immersion. No cell phones, selfies, or group chats, just us. I floated along and found Munch's The Scream. It's a fascinating painting of an image of a woman standing on a bridge with her hands to her ears and her mouth open with a silent expression of a desperate scream. I was first struck by how small it was. I'd always had this sense of it being much larger, like the woman's sense of overwhelming despair. It turns out it was not the actual painting, but a considerably smaller pastel of the same image that Munch had done later. But what was even stranger than the diminutive pastel study of the Scream was its hideous frame. It was in a style that was completely incongruous with the drawing itself and was relatively massive, as if the frame was muffling the scream, like it was saying, "Shh, this is a museum, don't scream." I chuckled and turned the corner, and there it was, Van Gogh's Starry Night. I instantly recognized it from the innumerable prints that I had seen on posters and in books. The swirling night sky in bursts of color depicting the glowing moon and stars. But more than just a rendering of an image, in person the painting is entirely different. Van Gogh's brushstrokes lift the paint off the canvas, revealing the depth of the explosion of color. As I stood in the presence of the painting, I thought to myself, wow, this guy Van Gogh has a lot going on in his head. Not sure what it is, but it's a lot. For a brief moment, I stood mesmerized in front of the painting in an almost hypnotic trance. Not only was I sensing the expression of the painting, but it almost seemed that I sensed the presence of Van Gogh himself. There was nothing else in the moment but the art and the artist, transcending time and space. That moment passed, and I wandered further into the gallery to another room with Monet's water lilies. I had always recalled this as a painting of a bridge over a pond. But this installation was a series of floor-to-ceiling canvases surrounding the room, one of many variations of the theme of the flower garden at Monet's Gavarni home. I quickly became immersed in the presence of the flowers and the plants, depicted as gently undulating colors and pixelations that created the sense that I was no longer in the museum in Midtown Manhattan, but in a French garden with a summer breeze and rustling of leaves. I could almost feel the embrace of the warm summer air of late 19th century France brush across my skin. I exited the gallery and drifted out of the museum. Somehow I was aware of the passage of time, the need to return to the hotel to collect my things and head to the airport. Once out on the street, returning to the normal of the day, I passed a colleague on the way back to the hotel. I briefly wondered what they were doing there and what a coincidence it was to see them in New York when I remembered that I was there with them on the business trip. For those transcendent moments in the museum, I'd been transported to a different place, a different time, and I was emerging into the pedestrian reality of the present, returning to the linear dimension of now. I flagged down a cab, headed to the airport, and in a few hours was back home in Chicago. But in a way, even after the years that have since passed, I am still there, in the streets of Manhattan, the museum, alive with the paintings, and ambling along the ubiquitous hexagonal asphalt pavers of New York City parks.
Hello, friends. My full name is Carmen Julia Agoyo Silva. I've always brought back postcards and plenty of pictures from the countries I explored. When reminiscing with them later, my most memorable experiences were often the kindness that were bestowed on me. A time that particularly sticks in my mind occurred during the first trip I took to Palestine, Israel in 1977 to study and volunteer in kibbutzim. To make the most of my stay in the country, I ventured out every weekend to sightsee and meet the locals. Once I decided to take a Friday afternoon excursion to the fabled city of Jerusalem. First hitchhiking from my kibbutz, then taking the bus from Haifa. I arrived after a couple of hours on a perfect late summer day. I immediately went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the old part of town to photograph the area. Soon, a preteen boy approached me and asked in English if I wanted for him to take my picture with the facade at my back. I learned his name was Omar. As I was accepting his offer, his mother and little sister showed up asking him to come home for the afternoon snack. He introduced me to them, and the mother told me her name was Fatima and the sister was Mariam. She invited me to her house and I agreed, but first we finished the photo session. As we began walking to their house, I asked if they knew of a hostel nearby because I needed 2 nights lodging and wanted to be in the center of everything. Fatima assured me that I could be their guest. I was hesitant, but she seemed sincere. On arrival to her place, her older daughter, Leila, was preparing tea, dates, pita, and goat cheese for us. She was a college student at the Palestinian University in town. Fatima, Leila, and I settled down, eating and getting to know each other. We found common ground because we were activists in the peace movement in the country, and we were also volunteers at the School for Israelis and Palestinians, which was established so that both could be educated together in order to learn from each other and display acceptance and mutual respect. During our conversation, I felt at ease because they were genuine in their values. When Fatima brought up the subject of her earlier offer, I decided to accept and thank them profusely. Before dinner that evening, their father came home. His name was Ali, and he told me that they had never come across a Latin or a Peruvian person, and that he was honored to have met me. They were also impressed that I knew a couple of dozen words and phrases in Arabic, and they praised my pronunciation. The family gracious hospitality continued throughout my stay with them. In spite of the world's seemingly never-ending problems due to war and animosity between ethnicities and religions, I've been fortunate to have had many encounters with kind strangers who appear at the right time. I always say that the great majority of people in the world are good. That's what gives me hope for the future of humanity. Thank you.